Greetings. A little over a week ago, Dante Fortson had a somewhat curious thread on Facebook, which struck me as interesting enough to share and make a short video on. And so the thread began with him sharing a post from Michael Heiser and offering the comment that you see at the top of your screen. Quote, "The book of Enoch says the children of angels had white skin. Is Heiser lying about Enoch or not?" End quote. Dante Fortson's allusion to the possibility that Heiser might be lying about something can pique one's curiosity, and therefore it's worthwhile to take a look at this post from Michael Heiser, which Dante Fortson shared. It begins with an image which has a quote within it, which reads as follows, quote, "I don't consider the book of 1st Enoch to be inspired and canonical, but that is no excuse for neglecting it in the study of Scripture," end quote. The statement within that image was actually an excerpt from the caption of the image, which I'd like to read now in its entirety, if you'll forgive a tiny bit of redundancy. The caption reads, quote, "A book that isn't considered inspired by most of Christianity, many are told, isn't valuable for biblical understanding. Consequently, unlike Peter and Jude, whose New Testament contributions show a close knowledge of 1st Enoch, many Christians not only never read 1st Enoch, but are discouraged from doing so. I don't consider the book of 1st Enoch to be inspired and canonical, but that is no excuse for neglecting it in the study of Scripture. Frankly, this entire book is testimony to the folly of this inattention," end quote. Now, that seems pretty uncontroversial, and therefore, unsurprisingly, in the comment section, a gentleman named Jefte asked the question that several might have had in mind. As you see at the top of the screen, where is the lie about Enoch, Dante? And Dante Fortson responded in his usual polite and cordial way, stating the following, "What lie? I asked a question. Do you people not know what question marks are? Now I see why y'all so dumb and blind that you were following an angel worshiper." At that point, I shared that I too was interested in the unstated reasoning of his post and added that clear writing requires clear thinking. Fortunately, Dante Fortson found it in the kindness of his heart to attempt to share a bit more of his reasoning. He wrote the following, quote, "Did he lie or not? If you read Enoch, you have to admit everyone on earth was not white before the flood. Enoch says the children of the angels, Nephilim, were white," end quote. And then he proceeded to share a bit more, which is somewhat outside of the book of Enoch and is actually covered in a couple of videos he has on his channel. If we can summarize what we have so far just a bit, we can say we have Michael Heiser on one side, or Michael Heiser's post on one side, and then we have Dante Fortson or his post commenting on Heiser's post on the other. On the side of Heiser's post, we have the fact that he doesn't consider the book of Enoch to be canonical or inspired. However, a second point is that Heiser still thinks Enoch has value to biblical study. Meanwhile, on the other side, we have Dante Fortson's curious post, in which first he shares that he thinks that reading Enoch forces one to conclude that no one was quote-unquote white before the flood, and then second, in which Dante wants to ask if Heiser was lying about something. At this point, we should take a look at the relevant text in the book of Enoch. And depending on your edition, the text that Dante Fortson had in mind was either in the 105th chapter or the 106th. In this particular edition I'll be using, it's in the 106th chapter. And what the text is describing is the birth of Noah. Beginning at verse 2, it reads, "His body was white as snow and red as the bloom of a rose, and the hair of his head was white as wool, and his eyes beautiful. And when he opened his eyes, they illuminated the whole house like the sun, and the whole house became exceedingly light." Now, at this point, we should cover some apparent or potential misunderstandings on the part of Dante Fortson. First, he may have lost sight of the fact that Heiser explicitly said he did not consider this text inspired. Saying this text has relevant to biblical study doesn't mean that he needs to consider a particular part to be historical. Second, and more importantly, Heiser saying the text has relevance to biblical study does not mean that he's going to interpret the text the way that Dante Fortson does. Dante Fortson has a certain interpretation which I think is unjustified, and he seems to simply assume it as if it's a blunt fact, and therefore Heiser's interest in the text somehow must, entail incorporating Dante's interpretation of the text. And third, regarding Dante Fortson's interpretation of the text, he takes the word white in that passage and he filters it through a very American understanding, treating it as the way it's used in American settings as a quote-unquote racial or morphological category. However, when Dante Fortson uses the word quote-unquote white to refer to one of his fellow Americans, he's referring not to a person who is literally as white as snow, rather he's referring to someone who comes in a shade of pink or beige or maybe light brown. He's typically not referring to a person who has hair which is as white as wool, and he's definitely not referring to a person whose eyes glow to such an extent that it can illuminate an entire room. Without intending any disrespect to Dante Fortson, I must confess that I do wonder if he's ever read this text directly or if he merely heard about it from others or read about it somewhere, and if he has read it directly, how closely he read it. Beyond that, I also have to confess that I find a certain amount of humor in at least the possibility that when Dante Fortson imagines the historical Noah as described in the book of Enoch, he might imagine that perhaps Noah looked something like Vocab Malone. Anyway, all kidding aside, getting back to the text and Dante Fortson's assertion that Enoch states that no one was quote-unquote white before the flood, but the Nephilim, the children of angels, were quote-unquote white. The text does state that Noah's look was somewhat unprecedented for human beings and did resemble the sons of angels. But again, the text is not describing a look that's typical of those fellow Americans of Dante Fortson whom he refers to as quote-unquote white. Rather, it's referring to something that would even be out of the ordinary today, whether it be in America or Europe or anywhere else, where a person has skin that's white as snow, hair that's white as snow, and eyes that glow. But let's go a tad deeper on the quote-unquote whiteness of Noah according to the book of Enoch. If you turn to the range of chapters from the 85th chapter to the 89th chapter, or depending on your edition, maybe from the 84th chapter to the 88th chapter, whatever, within that range of the second half of the chapters that are in the 80s, Enoch is quoted as recounting a vision he had, some rather metaphorical vision, but nonetheless a vision of not only Noah, but Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the progenitors of the tribes of Israel. So, beginning at 85:2 in this edition, it reads, Enoch began and said to his son Methuselah, to thee, my son, I will speak. Hear my words, and lend thy ear to the vision of the dream of thy father. Before I took thy mother, Edna, I saw in a vision on my couch, and behold, a bullock came out of the earth, and this bullock was white. Now, the text goes on to have that white bull beget other white bulls, but for now, just keep that white bull in mind. Jumping to 87:2, Enoch is quoted as stating, I again raised my eyes to heaven and saw in the vision, and behold, there came from heaven those who were like white men. One came out from that place, and three with him. And those three who came out last took me by the hand, and bore me away from the generations of the earth, and elevated me to a large place, and showed me a tower higher than the earth, and all the hills were lower. Now, regarding those four individuals who are described as white men, I would submit that those were angels. So this shows that it's not only the sons of angels that are white, described as white, but also it's the angels themselves are white. Now, I want to be careful to note that the text does not mean white in the American racial or morphological sense. It's not saying that these four angels looks like the Marx Brothers or something like that. Rather, the text is saying that they're literally white. Again, imagine white skin, white hair, glowing eyes. They were glowing. Anyway, jumping to chapter 89, as you see on the bottom of your screen here, the text goes on to state that one of those white angels went and taught a mystery to one of those aforementioned white bulls. Then the chapter goes on to state the following regarding Enoch's vision of that white bull. He was born a bullock and became a man, and he made for himself a large vessel and lived in it. And 3 bullocks lived with him in that vessel, and it was covered over above them. And I again raised my eyes towards heaven, and saw a high roof, and 7 sluices to it. And those sluices emptied much water into a yard. And I saw again, and behold, fountains were opened on the earth, and in that great yard, and that water began to swell, and to be lifted above the land, and caused that yard to disappear, until all the land was covered with water. And now, jumping ahead to verse 7, it continues, And again I saw in the vision till those sluices were put away from that high roof, and the fountains of the earth dried up, and other abysses were opened. Then the water began to run into these till the earth became uncovered. But that vessel reached the earth, and the darkness retreated, and it became light. But that white bullock, which had become a man, came out of that vessel, and the 3 bullocks with him. And one of the 3 bullocks was white, similar to that first bullock, and one of them was red like blood, and one was black. Now, at this point, I think it's obvious that this vision is referring to Noah and his 3 sons on the ark. The vision goes on to allude to the various offspring of Noah's 3 sons, and then verse 10, towards the end of verse 10, it states, And among them was born a white bullock. So it's referring to another white bull. And then slightly later in verse 11, it states, But that white bullock, which was born among them, begat a wild ass, and a white bullock with it. And the wild ass increased. But that bull, which was born from him, begat a black wild boar, and a white sheep. And this wild boar begat many boars, but that sheep produced 12 sheep. And when these 12 sheep had grown, they gave one of them to the asses, and these asses then gave that sheep to the wolves. And that sheep grew up among the wolves, and the Lord brought the 11 sheep to live with it, and to pasture with it among the wolves. And they increased, and became many herds of sheep, and the wolves began to fear and oppress them. For those who might not have immediately caught it, here's a quick key to the different people being symbolized in that vision, and you can go back and reread the text with this key in mind. Noah is depicted as a white bull. Abraham is depicted as a white bull. Ishmael is described as a wild ass. Isaac is described as a white bull. Esau is described as a black boar. Jacob is described as a white sheep, and then the Egyptians are described as wolves. Now, I fully understand that obviously these men weren't literally bulls or donkeys or sheep or boars or wolves, and therefore the text is metaphorical. I understand that, but it does raise an interesting question as to how metaphorical or how literal the color references are. And the reason why this is significant is because the text then goes on to describe Noah as literally white. And again, I don't mean like quote unquote white like you see many of Dante Fortson's fellow Americans, who are actually beige or pink or light brown or something like that. I'm talking literally white like snow with glowing eyes. Now, it's also worth noting that if we're going to force Enoch to be the lens through which we view accepted biblical texts, it will wind up having a huge impact on how we understand that text in the first chapter of Revelation, which describes Christ in a sort of glorified state, which describes him as having not only his hair being white like snow and white like wool, but also his head separate from his hairs being white like snow and white like wool, and his eyes being like fire, and his feet being like metal that was burning in a furnace, and his face being like the sun. The overall depiction is of a person who is glowing. And so that description of Noah in the 105th or 106th chapter of Enoch, depending on your edition, would match up with that rather well. If the text of Enoch is the lens through which we interpret accepted or uncontroversially accepted canonically biblical text, then we could easily reach the conclusion that Revelation 1 is describing Christ in a glorified state, admittedly, but nonetheless describing Christ as literally white, glowing, just like his ancestor Noah was glowing when he was born. I know I covered a lot of text, but getting back to Dante Fortson's Facebook post from a little over a week ago, I feel he misunderstood both Heiser's post and especially the text of Enoch. However, one question which remains unanswered is what Dante was referring to when he asked if Heiser was lying. There were attempts to get him to clarify what he had in mind, but they were not very fruitful or successful. So I just want to share this last portion because I know that some feel that Dante is often unwilling to answer clarifying questions, but I think this might show that, with all due respect to Dante, perhaps sometimes the problem is he does not understand the question being posed to him. So he received fairly detailed replies from both me and Jephthah regarding Heiser and, the book of Enoch and all that. And he skipped over all of that. He skipped over those detailed replies on Heiser and Enoch, but he did respond as follows, quote, "I asked a question. I never said he was lying. Do you have an answer to the question? I swear you all are dumb on purpose," end quote. At that point, it was once again pointed out that clear writing requires clear thinking, and then there was an attempt to clarify by noting that his question was vague and that he needs to clarify, is Heiser lying about what? He asks if he lies, but lying about what? And Dante's next reply read, quote, "My question is not vague. I asked, is he lying or not? It only requires a yes or no answer. Stuff only becomes vague when you all want to play stupid. Anyone with a brain knows a question mark indicates a question and not a declarative or imperative statement. I asked a yes or no question followed by a question mark. Not sure what isn't clear." And so yet another attempt was made to try to get Dante to clarify his question. He keeps asking if Heiser is lying, but he's failing to clarify what it is he thinks Heiser might be lying about. The question, is Heiser lying, begs a second question, lying about what? And Dante's only reply was to repeat the question, is Heiser lying or not? And of course that, in an attempt to be fair with him, once again, he was asked, lying about what? But it seems like he never got it. It just went on and on like that in that sort of circle. Is Heiser lying? Lying about what? Is he lying or not? Is he lying about what? Is he lying or not? It was that sort of an exchange. It was quite frustrating for him as well, apparently, because eventually what happened was he started resorting to insults, quite disgusting insults. For example, you'll see here he posts a picture of a raccoon, a little cartoon raccoon, and then he employed these little raccoon emojis, which he intended as a rather gross racial slur. At that point, the thread had reached rock bottom, and there really wasn't much point in going on. In a sad bit of irony, in the recent past, Dante Fortson had railed against Vocab Malone's Private Eye for Yahushai skit, which satirized other Israelites, employing precisely the disgusting slur alluded to in that emoji. Those other Israelites employ that disgusting slur when people question them. And Dante thought that skit was outrageous, but now we see that he sinks to the same depths, employing basically the same disgusting language in a not-so-veiled way. It's honestly quite sad. On that unfortunate note, I'll close here by saying that it is my sincere hope that we can have a cordial correspondence with Dante Fortson in the future. But either way, I look forward to the comments of others. As always, God bless.